Hello and welcome to Eastern Europe Review, a joint production of BELSAT TV and TVP World. Today we are going to explore the dynamic developments unfolding across Eastern Europe, with a particular focus on Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. I'm Igor Kule, and here is what we've prepared for you today. Western sanctions impact. Russia faces potential shortage of passenger aircraft.
In a sense, the overhaul and repair of both planes and engines is exactly where the bottleneck is. Such overhaul capacities exist, but the problem is that the production capacities of the remaining enterprises are limited.
Tragic loss. Another political prisoner dies in Belarus.
What we once perceived as extreme measures against Lukashenko's elected opponents are now becoming the norm for political prisoners.
And infrastructure neglect. Orenburg region in Russia submerged underwater.
Grandmothers are dying. Grandmas are drowning because they cannot leave their houses.
Russia's civilian aircraft production faces disruption due to import substitution challenges. Following the invasion of Ukraine, Western companies have halted supplies, impacting the industry. The Kremlin's ambitious plan to produce over 1,000 airliners by 2030 is now considered unrealistic. Officials acknowledge delays, suggesting that it may take up to 2 years for the first Russian machines to be produced. Meanwhile, the aging fleet is nearing a critical point, sparking concerns over regional flights.
Traveling by airplane is often the only option to reach settlements in the Russian regions of Siberia and the Far East, where road infrastructure is virtually non-existent. Recently, 2 local airlines have appealed to the Russian government to extend the service life of Soviet-era Antonov aircraft, many of which are over 50 years old. These propeller-driven planes are currently the only viable option for transportation in the remote regions of the far north.
I've flown on board the AN-24 several times. It's what my father used to call a flying tractor. It just keeps flying and gets you to your destination. Don't be afraid to fly on it. We've been flying on it for a long time.
Siberia currently relies on over 100 propeller aircraft, including AN-24s and AN-26s, many of which have exceeded their service life. However, these planes are the only means of transport that connects cities and remote settlements in the region. With Western manufacturers withdrawing from the Russian market, there are no alternatives available. Additionally, the maintenance costs for these aging aircraft are increasing.
The AN-24 and AN-26 are and remain the only affordable form of passenger and cargo transportation across the territory of the Republic of Sakha in Yakutia. So far, there is no substitute for this type of aircraft. However, in the last 2 years, operations have been associated with problems regarding the supply of spare parts for engine repairs. They concern not only our airline, but also all operators of AN-24s and AN-26s. It is necessary to resolve this issue.
The Antonovs were supposed to be replaced by a small domestic airliner, the Ladoga, produced by the Ural Works of Civil Aviation. However, this model has yet to be certified. The situation in the segment of the oldest aircraft vividly reflects the general state of Russian passenger aviation. The majority of these aircraft are produced by Boeing and Airbus. Many of these planes were in fact stolen from Western lessors after the full-scale war with Ukraine began. Russian airlines are attempting to circumvent Western sanctions by purchasing spare parts from third countries and performing aircraft repairs themselves. However, this approach does not address the problem.
In a sense, the overhaul and repair of both planes and engines is exactly where the bottleneck is. Such overhaul capacities exist, but the problem is that the production capacities of the remaining enterprises are limited.
After the announcement of Western sanctions in 2022, President Putin approved a program for the mass production of domestic civil aircraft. More than $12 billion were allocated from the budget for this program. aiming to produce over 1,000 airliners of various types by 2030. However, 2 years later, the head of the state corporation Rostec provided significantly different figures.
Our main civil projects are, first and foremost, the production of civil aircraft for civilian aviation. According to the program that you approved, we have to produce more than 500 aircraft of various types by the year 2030.
However, even these figures seem to be far from reality. The Russian Ministry of Industry has officially announced the postponement of the start of deliveries of all Russian passenger airplanes developed to replace the Western fleet by at least 2 years. The business press views this as the final acknowledgement of the impossibility of import substitution in the aviation industry.
Another political prisoner has tragically died in Belarusian custody, adding to the growing concern over human rights violations in the country. Meanwhile, the health of Nobel Peace Prize winner Ales Bialiatski continues to deteriorate. Belarusian Democratic leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has been tirelessly advocating for the release of political prisoners, recently bringing attention to their plight at the Delphi Economic Forum in Greece. Thousands remain imprisoned, and the challenges faced by Belarusians who dare to express their political beliefs appear to have no solution in sight.
Another Belarusian political prisoner has died behind bars. Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Kulinich passed away in prison just over a month after being detained.
This is a terrible tragedy. Alexander Kolinich shouldn't have been put behind bars. Expressing an opinion, criticizing the government, a common practice in a democratic state that fulfill basic human rights.
From a video recorded by security forces during Alexander's detention, it appears that he was accused of making comments under a published speech by Alexander Lukashenko. A criminal case was initiated for defamation, and the man was held in a pre-trial detention center.
There are special cells in this pre-trial detention center number 7, where people are subjected to special torture. They are located in the basement.
According to available information, Alexander's death marks at least the 10th known death of a political prisoner behind bars in Belarus since 2020. Meanwhile, it has been 1,000 days since Nobel laureate and human rights defender Ales Bialiatski was imprisoned, and his health is steadily deteriorating. Bialiatski, the former head of the human rights center Vyasna, has been held in solitary confinement for the past 6 months.
I've learned from people who have left the prison that Ales's condition continues to deteriorate and he doesn't receive some of the medicines he needs. The penal colony in Gorky has a terrible reputation, and human rights activists know that it serves as a conveyor belt for the torture of political prisoners.
The transfer from a penal colony to a prison regime exemplifies the pressure exerted on political prisoners. A trial has commenced in the case of Alexander Kapshul, the former legal advisor of the polymer factory, who has been sentenced to 15 years under 3 criminal charges, including treason.
Prison means you just sit in a cell and only go for a walk once a day. It's brutal. It hits people's health very, very badly. It's a very strong blow to a person when he is cut off from social interactions. Depriving people of communication in prison can also be considered equivalent to torture.
In addition to torture, political prisoners are also subjected to food deprivation. Vladimir Gundar, sentenced to 20 years in prison and currently held in solitary confinement, had this restriction extended for another year.
Especially if he is kept in solitary confinement, without cellmates who can share food deliveries. The inability to buy food or receive food transfers greatly affects a person's health. There has been information about political prisoners developing scurvy.
Scurvy, caused by a critical lack of vitamin C, was observed in the political prisoner Stepan Latipau, who attempted suicide during his trial in 2021. Stepan continues to endure torture through his detention conditions and is denied proper medical care.
What we once perceived as extreme measures against Lukashenko's elected opponents are now becoming the norm for political prisoners. Individual destinies become imperceptible amidst dozens, even thousands of cases.
Arrests for political reasons are continuing in Belarus. It has recently been reported that Minsk activist Halina Lagatskaya was detained for 72 hours. Security forces invited her to the police station to retrieve her phone, which had been confiscated last year, but they did not allow her to leave.
Russia is literally sinking as it is facing its worst floods in 30 years. According to the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations, flooding has affected numerous regions across the country. The situation is particularly dire in the Urals, specifically in the Orenburg region, where over 11,000 houses have been submerged. However, what raises the most questions is the response of the Russian authorities to these events.
Spring in Russia this year has arrived suddenly as usual. The rise in temperatures has led to a sudden thaw of snow, leading to widespread flooding. Over 40 regions have been affected, with more than 11,000 homes flooded. The flood damage in the Orenburg region alone exceeds $430 million, with media reports confirming at least 4 deaths. Desperate pleas for assistance are echoing from affected communities. Since the onset of the crisis, many are asking, where is the Russian president? Why hasn't he visited the flood-affected regions? On Wednesday, April the 10th, Vladimir Putin's press secretary stated that there are no plans for such visits.
The situation is really tense, and it requires concerted efforts from government officials at all levels to help people. And what about a visit by Vladimir Putin to the affected regions? There are no such plans at the moment.
The Minister of Emergency Situations was dispatched from the federal center to the Orenburg region, but controversy ensued. The minister attributed blame to the residents, claiming they had been warned about the need to evacuate a week prior to a dam bursting. However, there was no such warning. In fact, just 2 days before the disaster, the mayor assured the public that the dam had been inspected and deemed safe.
The evacuation was announced a week ago. People didn't decide to evacuate. They thought it was some kind of a joke. People aren't afraid of being flooded. We remember the times when Orsk experienced floods without a dam, when the floodwaters engulfed houses on Nabyeryzhny Street. But there is no such threat now.
People, enraged by such lies, took to the streets to demand answers.
Grandmothers are dying. Grandmothers are drowning because they cannot leave their houses. Everyone saw the conditions of this dam. Before it burst, people had seen it leaking for 3 days. They called the administration and warned about it, but there was no reaction. Eventually, on the 5th of April, it burst in one place, then in the 2nd, in the 3rd, and in the 4th. That is here. In this situation, only the authorities are to blame. This is what local residents say.
When Putin's authorities recognized that there was a potential for protests if they continued to blame citizens, they resorted to a time-tested tactic, finding an external enemy. Putin's plenipotentiary representative in the Urals blamed Kazakhstan for the natural disaster, asserting that such a severe flood would not have occurred if Kazakhstan had discharged water from its reservoirs more consistently. However, experts disagree.
Spring floods are typical in snow-covered areas, and the magnitude of floods depends on how much snow was accumulated over winter and how rapidly this snow melts. So this year we had a very considerable accumulation of snow over winter, and that rapid spring warming, when temperature went from sub-zero to something like 17-18 degrees, and snow melted very quickly, and that's what caused the flood.
The amount of money being mentioned by officials as potential compensation are insufficient to even cover the cost of damaged household appliances, let alone repairs to housing. Moreover, Russian residents fear that they may not receive this compensation at all.
And that's all for today. Eastern Europe Review will be back next Sunday. I'm Igor Kuley. Please stay with us here on TVP World.